The flower moon is a name given to the full moon that occurs in the month of May, according to some Native American traditions. It is called the flower moon because May is the month when many flowers begin to bloom in the northern hemisphere. The flower moon is a beautiful and significant event that has been celebrated by many cultures for centuries. It is a reminder of the cycles of nature and the importance of honoring and respecting the natural world around us. The Osage Reign of Terror was a period of violence and corruption that occurred in the early 20th century in Oklahoma, where the Osage Nation is located. The Osage Nation had become incredibly wealthy due to oil reserves discovered on their land. Several members of the Osage Nation were murdered, including prominent leaders and wealthy members of the tribe. Many of these murders were committed by individuals seeking to gain control of the tribe's mineral rights and wealth, and the investigations into these crimes were often obstructed or corrupted by local officials and law enforcement. What would unfold in the coming years would be both tragic and downright evil. The Osage tribe is a Native American people originally from what is known today as the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. The Osage people migrated westward over time and eventually settled in present-day Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, and Oklahoma by the 1800s. The government repeatedly forced the Osage to pick up and move from their settlements, but in 1871, this was the third and most brutal displacement. The Osage people were nearly destroyed, as the highest death rate seemed to be among young mothers and infants. Like other tribes, the Osage relied on hunting and gathering, but they also took pride in an extensive agriculture and trading system. Just from grazing alone, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs called the Osages the richest people on earth. Now, this isn't even counting the petroleum income that wouldn't start until 1906. Principal Chief James Bigheart was a fierce advocate for his people's rights and worked tirelessly to protect their lands, culture, and traditions. He was instrumental in negotiating several treaties between the Osage Nation and the U.S. government, including the 1906 Osage Allotment Act, which gave individual land ownership to tribal members. He also helped negotiate mineral rights to their lands. Unlike other reservation allotments in Oklahoma, the Osage had purchased their reservation land and owned it outright. Osage County never fell under the Homestead Act of 1862. The prosperity the Osage experienced attracted greedy, money-hungry outsiders. In a span of 5 years, from 1921 to 1926, at least 20 Osage Native Americans were murdered in cold blood. In the early 1900s, the oil business was booming across Oklahoma. Just behind me here is where the $1 Million Elm once stood. This was the site of public oil and natural gas lease auctions that began in November of 1912. Colonel Ellsworth Walters became the official auctioneer of the Osage Nation in 1916. The Osage were the wealthiest group of people in the country per capita by the early 1920s. In 1923, the Osage oil boom hit its peak and the tribe earned more than $30 million in revenue. The government deemed the Osage to be incompetent and forced them to enter guardianships where they wouldn't have control over their very own money, but their white neighbors were actually placed in control. White settlers would pull out all the stops to trick, steal, or even try to inherit their fortunes. Scott Mathis, who owned the Big Hill Trading Company, is one of those individuals who took advantage of the Osage. This empty lot here is where his business once stood. He regularly overcharged the Osage for caskets and burials, and even went as far as to falsify autopsy reports to help cover up Osage murders. One of the most infamous individuals involved in this story is a woman by the name of Molly Burkhart. She was born in Grayhorse, Oklahoma. She was a full-blooded Osage woman and was married to a white man named Ernest Burkhart, who hailed from Texas. They lived together in various houses in Fairfax. Her siblings, Rita and Anna, also married white men. Sadly, her sister Minnie passed away due to a strange wasting illness that was later theorized as poisoning. The tragedy would continue as another one of Molly's sisters, Anna, was missing. Sadly, she was found dead. Here in 3 Mile Canyon, just along this ravine here, is where Anna Brown's body was found. She was shot in the head, execution style. Just prior to Anna's death, another Osage man named Charles Whitehorn was found murdered in the same manner near this location not far from Pawhuska. Molly knew her family was being targeted once her mother passed away from the same strange wasting illness as Minnie had. A couple of years after Anna was murdered, Henry Roan was also found dead, slumped over the steering wheel of his Buick, shot in the back of the head just like Anna. From the top of this mesa, we have a pretty good vantage point of the ravine down below where Henry Roan's vehicle was found. And years earlier, Molly was married to Henry. The next month, Molly's sister Rita and her husband Bill Smith were killed in an explosion that reduced their Fairfax home to rubble. With the passing of Rita and Bill Smith, Molly and Ernest inherited a fortune from their estate. Also in Fairfax is where the Shawn brothers' offices were located. Flowers of the Killer Moon author David Grann theorizes that the brothers were actively involved with purposefully botching autopsy results, that they falsified death certificates, they expedited burials, and even poisoned several Osage tribal members. It seems as if many different facets of society played a role in the Reign of Terror. Osage County Sheriff Harv Freeze wasn't putting much time into the investigations, so the Osage sent trusted friend and rancher Barney McBride up to Washington, D.C. to ask for help. He was in D.C. for just 1 day before he was killed. W.W. Vaughn was the attorney and confidant of George Big Heart. In 1923, he was strangled and thrown from a train not too far from this location. Big Heart himself passed away, sadly another victim of poisoning. In March of 1923, the Osage Tribal Council begged for U.S. government intervention with the numbers of murders skyrocketing. The murders finally caught the attention of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, who finally traveled to Osage County to investigate the slew of murders. By this point, even more people were dead, including an oilman and a lawyer who both took it upon themselves to try and solve the murders. Tom White, a former Texas Ranger, was dispatched to Oklahoma by Hoover. As Tom White dug in, the more people he talked to, and he talked with moonshiners, cattlemen, bootleggers, the more he found out that there was a deeply corrupt element in play. During the conversations, 3 names continued to surface: Ernest Burkhart, John Ramsey, and William Hill. William Hill, Ernest Burkhart's uncle, was a former cattle rancher from Greenville, Texas, who worked as a deputy sheriff for Osage County. Immediately after Anna's murder, he consoled Molly and her family and stated that he would help find the killer. In addition to being a deputy sheriff, he owned a ranch, had fine horses, and donated large sums of money to schools and hospitals. He was well connected and seemed to control the town's citizens and everything going on around the region, especially the fortunes of several Osage. He was known as the King of the Osage Hills. He even referred to himself as a true friend of the Osages. Unfortunately, it eventually came out that William Hill was the man pulling the strings and orchestrated the plot to kill Molly's family one by one, and eventually even kill Molly herself, with an end goal of controlling the entire family's fortune, even encouraging Ernest to marry Molly. The big break in the case came when a prisoner at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister named Bert Lawson admitted he was instrumental in building and placing the bomb that blew up Bill and Rita Smith's house in Fairfax. Most importantly, he implicated Hill. Probably the worst part of these accusations is that Molly's own husband Ernest was involved in the plot all along. Ernest Burkhart finally cracked under interrogation and gave up John Ramsey as the murderer of Henry Roan. He also confessed to being involved with the explosion at Bill and Rita Smith's house, and even implicated his own uncle Bill Hill as the leader. In January of 1926, Bill Hill, Ernest Burkhart, and John Ramsey were arrested, and 3 months later, Kelsey Morrison and Byron Burkhart were also arrested. The killings quickly subsided after Bill Hill's arrest. Tom White and his team confronted Hill with a mountain of evidence, but Hill seemed unshaken by the accusations and vowed to fight. The trials themselves were an absolute circus, with numerous deadlocked juries, appeals, and overturned verdicts. Between 1926 and 1929, several defendants, including the Burkhart brothers, were tried in federal and state courts in Guthrie, Oklahoma City, Bartlesville, and this one right here in Pawhuska. In June 1926, Ernest pleaded guilty and received a life sentence for the murder of Bill Smith. During the trials, Ernest Burkhart flipped back and forth on testifying against his uncle, but it didn't keep Hill from ultimately being found guilty in 1929 after a fourth trial, convicted for the murder of Henry Roan, and given life in prison. Kelsey Morrison admitted that he pulled the trigger and killed Anna Brown at Bill Hill's request. It was also uncovered that Bill Hill was the beneficiary of Henry Roan's $25,000 life insurance policy. I think one of the saddest parts about the murder of Henry Roan was the fact that up until his death, he fully believed that Bill Hill was his best friend. Afterwards, White would retire from the FBI and took the warden job at Leavenworth Prison, where, ironically, Bill Hill would be one of his prisoners. After leaving Leavenworth Federal Prison, Tom White then came down here to El Paso, Texas, and was the warden at the Latuna Federal Prison, which is right there behind me. He retired in 1957 and passed away on December 21st, 1971 at the age of 90. He's now buried right here in El Paso, Texas. William Hill was paroled by Oklahoma Governor Henry Bellman on July 31st, 1947. He then spent some time in Montana before moving to Arizona. Forbidden to return to Oklahoma, William Hill died at the age of 87 in Phoenix, Arizona in 1962. His remains are located here in Wichita, Kansas. Molly Burkhart would later remarry and passed away on June 16, 1937 as Molly Cobb, and is buried here in Grayhorse Cemetery. But also with her, her sister Minnie, sister Rita, her sister Anna, and then also her mom, Lizzie. The disgraced Ernest Burkhart received a full pardon from Governor Henry Bellman in 1965. He lived to be 94 years old, eventually passing away in December of 1986. His ashes were thrown into an anonymous river. From 2012 to 2015, David Gran made several trips to the Osage Reservation to conduct research for his book. He spent countless hours and days looking through the National Archives and speaking with Burkhart descendants that were affected by the Reign of Terror. What he found was terrifying and sad. He found evidence that the FBI failed to solve the majority of the Osage murders. Hundreds of Osage Native Americans were killed over the course of just a couple of decades, not just 5 years. Like most stories involving Native Americans, especially in Oklahoma, they've been swept under the rug and purposefully left out of the school curriculum. The Reign of Terror eventually came to an end with the intervention of the federal government and the establishment of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This period of violence and corruption remains a tragic chapter in the history of the Osage Nation and serves as a reminder of the ongoing struggles faced by indigenous peoples in the United States.